John Harper, a Vietnam veteran, was denied the medical care he had earned, left struggling as if his service had never mattered. The cold machinery of the VA system hid behind paperwork, shutting him out with indifference that felt like betrayal. But when a forgotten folder of military records surfaced, everything changed in an instant. And just wait until you hear how this stunning twist forced the system to finally deliver justice. John Harper carried himself with quiet dignity. His back was a little stooped, his hair silvered with age, but his eyes still held the sharp focus of a man who had once faced the unknown with courage. He had given everything he could to his country in his youth, sweat, strength, and years that could never be returned. Yet through it all, he held on to one simple belief, that service meant honor, and honor meant that his nation would never abandon him. That belief shattered the day he walked into the Veterans Hospital in Texas. His breathing had grown shallow and heavy over the years, a weight pressing down on his lungs that medicine from a small-town pharmacy could no longer manage. He had reached a point where he needed real care, the kind he had been promised long ago. But instead of help, he was met with a cold wall of bureaucracy. At the reception desk, a clerk glanced at his worn ID, then shook her head. "Your benefits aren't confirmed. Without documentation, we can't help you." The words were delivered plainly, almost mechanically, but to John they cut deeper than any wound. For a moment he stood frozen, the hallway spinning around him. He pressed a hand to the counter, struggling to steady his breath. He tried to explain. He had served, he had the scars, he had lived through nights in the jungle when the only thought was survival. But the clerk didn't waver. Rules were rules, and the system had decided his service no longer counted without the right papers. That was the moment the air seemed to vanish from the room. John staggered back, his chest tightening, his mind refusing to accept what he had just heard. This was the country he had once trusted with his very life, the country he had watched friends fight and fall for. And now, when all he asked for was the care he had earned, it turned its face away. The anger wasn't loud. It didn't explode in shouting or curses. Instead, it burned low and heavy inside him, a flame fed by humiliation and disbelief. He wasn't just being told no. He was being told he didn't matter, that the sacrifices of his past had been forgotten, erased by missing files and indifferent hands. The image of that hallway lingers, a proud veteran standing unsteady, clutching the air as if it might slip away, while strangers walked past without understanding the weight of what was happening. It was more than a refusal of care. It was a betrayal of trust, the unraveling of a promise that had once been sacred. For anyone hearing his story, this moment is more than personal. It's a shocking injustice. A man who once stood at the front lines for his country was now forced to stand alone against the very system designed to protect him. And the cruelest part was the silence. No recognition, no compassion, just the echo of a simple phrase that denied his dignity. "We can't help you." Time passed, and with every month, John's condition grew worse. The once steady rhythm of his breath became shallow, uneven, a sound that filled the quiet of the house like an unspoken reminder of his struggle. He tried to hide it, not wanting his family to see how much it hurt simply to take in air. But even the smallest effort, walking across the living room, rising from his chair, left him clutching his chest, eyes closed against the weight pressing down on him. His wife, Linda, watched this decline with a kind of helpless sorrow only a partner of many decades could know. She remembered the man he once was, strong, decisive, the kind of person who carried others through difficult times. Now she watched him fade, and the only weapon she had against it was sacrifice. One by one, family belongings began to disappear. The old record player John loved, the antique clock that had been in the family for generations, sold to cover the rising costs of medication that offered relief, but never enough. The grandchildren noticed too. They were young, but not so young that they couldn't sense the gravity in the room. They whispered questions to their mother. "Why can't Grandpa get help?" There was no easy answer, only a silence heavy with frustration. For them, John was not a veteran with a file missing in some forgotten archive. He was their grandfather, the man who once told them bedtime stories, who showed them how to cast a fishing line, who always had a smile ready when they came running into his arms. To see him suffer, to watch him sit hunched and weary in his favorite chair, was more painful than they could understand. The bureaucracy only deepened the wound. Letters arrived in the mail, stamped with words that felt like a door slamming shut. Case closed. No grounds. Each envelope carried with it a hope that perhaps this time someone would finally listen, only for that hope to crumble when the papers revealed the same cold phrases over and over again. What made it even harder was the response from those within the system. Doctors and staff often showed sympathy, their voices soft and regretful. Some even whispered that they wished they could help. But in the end, the answer was always the same. "We need the paperwork." Those words became a kind of refrain, simple, firm, and final. No matter how genuine their concern seemed, the barrier never moved. This wasn't the battle John had prepared for. It wasn't a fight against a single adversary, someone whose intentions could be challenged or overcome. Instead, it was a fight against something faceless, a wall of rules and indifference, a maze with no clear exit. The enemy wasn't cruel in an obvious way. It was cruel because it didn't care at all. For the audience, this stage is painful to witness. It is not the pain of a single man, but of an entire family watching helplessly as the one they love most is let down again and again. It is the quiet devastation of being told in countless ways that service, sacrifice, and loyalty mean nothing without the right piece of paper. For months, John Harper had lived in a haze of disappointment. Every unanswered letter, every closed door left him feeling more invisible. But sometimes, when life pushes someone close to the edge, help appears in unexpected ways. That help came one quiet afternoon from across the street. Michael Kent, John's neighbor, had long admired him from afar. Michael knew John as the kind man who waved while watering his garden, who offered advice about repairing a fence, who never complained even as his health declined. But lately, Michael had noticed a change. The way John moved slower, the weariness in his eyes, the silence that replaced his once easy smile. Michael was no stranger to legal battles. Before retiring, he had worked as a lawyer, guiding families through complicated cases. When he saw the weight pressing down on John, he couldn't simply stand by. One evening, "By me," he walked up to John's porch, sat beside him, and said gently, "Let me help. You don't have to carry this alone." At first, John hesitated. He had grown used to disappointment. Hope, after all, was dangerous. It hurt too much when it slipped away. But Linda encouraged him. "What if this is the chance we've been waiting for?" she whispered. Slowly, John agreed, and so began their search. Together, John and Michael dug through every corner of the house. They opened old boxes stored in the attic, brushed away dust from forgotten trunks, flipped through yellowed photo albums and piles of letters tied with string. Each item carried memories, some joyful, some painful, but none seemed to hold the answer they needed. Days turned into weeks. Michael made phone calls to military archives, submitted requests to government offices, even reached out to fellow veterans who might remember serving with John. Time and again, the replies came back the same. No records available. Hope flickered, but it never fully went out. Michael's persistence was a lifeline, reminding John that someone still believed his fight mattered. Then, one late afternoon, while sorting through a battered box in the far corner of the attic, Linda's hand brushed against something different. She pulled out a folder, its edges frayed, its cover stained with time. Inside were papers long thought lost, military records, complete with stamps and signatures. Among them was the crucial report, the official documentation of John's injury in Vietnam. For a moment, the three of them simply stared at it. The silence was heavy, but this time not with despair. It was filled with awe, disbelief, and the stirring of something John hadn't felt in years, possibility. His hands trembled as he touched the faded pages. These weren't just papers. They were proof. Proof that his sacrifice had been real, that his story had weight, that the promises made to him still had the power to stand. It was a turning point. For John, the discovery was like a breath of fresh air after years of suffocation. For Linda, it was a sign that their fight hadn't been in vain. For Michael, it was the validation of his belief that justice could still be found, even buried beneath decades of dust. And for anyone watching, this was the spark of hope, the moment when a nearly broken man began to rise again. The day finally came when John Harper's story would be heard in a courtroom. It wasn't the battlefield he once knew, but in many ways, the stakes felt just as high. This was a fight for recognition, for dignity, for the promise that had been made to him decades earlier. Michael Kent, steady and determined, stood at his side, carrying the fragile folder of documents that had become their lifeline. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. The representatives from the Department of Veterans Affairs sat across the aisle, prepared with arguments and paperwork of their own. Their lawyer spoke firmly, insisting that the documents John had discovered were no longer valid. "Expired retention periods," he said, his tone suggesting finality, as if years on a calendar could erase sacrifice. But then came the moment that shifted everything. Michael placed the original records before the judge, pages stamped with official seals, signatures from military doctors whose ink had stood the test of time. The room fell quiet. The judge leaned forward, studying the papers carefully. For a long moment, no one spoke. When the silence broke, it carried the weight of justice. The judge looked up. His voice firm and unwavering. "This man served and suffered for his country. The nation owes him." Those words cut through years of indifference like a blade through heavy rope. The arguments from the opposing side faded. The wall of bureaucracy that had seemed unmovable cracked at last. In that instant, John Harper was no longer just another case number lost in a system. He was recognized, honored, and restored. Relief washed over John and his family. For the first time in years, the burden that had pressed on their shoulders began to lift. Soon after, John received the medical care he had long been denied. Doctors now treated him with urgency and respect, ensuring that his remaining years would be lived with dignity rather than constant struggle. At home, the change was immediate. Linda could finally put away the worry that had consumed her days. The grandchildren once again saw their grandfather smile, not with the forced bravery of someone hiding pain, but with genuine lightness. The household, once heavy with despair, filled slowly with warmth and gratitude. For the audience, this is the moment of triumph. The system that had nearly broken a man was forced to acknowledge the truth. What seemed impossible, one family standing against a faceless institution, had become reality. Justice had taken its time, but it had arrived, and beyond the victory itself lies something greater: inspiration. John's story is proof that even against the cold weight of bureaucracy, persistence can prevail. It shows that sometimes hope arrives in the form of an unexpected ally, a neighbor who refuses to give up, a family who refuses to stop fighting. His journey is more than a personal win. It is a reminder to everyone watching: never let silence or indifference erase your worth. With courage, perseverance, and support, even the steepest walls can be climbed.